Good day. Today is Saturday, 30th November 2024, and before I return to the perennial topic of these programs, I want to say something about the situation in the Middle East and specifically in Syria. Now, about 3 days ago, the Islamist forces who have been holding out in a small pocket in northwest Syria, in Idlib, launched an offensive towards the city of Aleppo. To the surprise of many people, including myself, the resistance from the Syrian army was barely evident, and this has enabled these forces, these Islamist forces, to advance all the way to the key city of Aleppo itself, the second biggest city in Syria and Syria's biggest industrial center. And this morning, we have reports that they are in occupation of 3/4 of Aleppo, and there still seems to be little sign of much organized resistance to their advance. At the same time, all sorts of towns and villages which had previously been captured by the Syrian army have also fallen under the control of these Islamist fighters. Now, yesterday, Professor Glenn Deason and myself had a discussion with Alistair Crook, the former British diplomat, who is far better informed about the situation in the Middle East than I am. He said that the force that has been assembled, the Islamist force which has been assembled and which is conducting this attack, numbers around 15,000 men, that's been built up and trained over a prolonged period, and it is heavily equipped with Western supplied weapons, many of them supplied ultimately from Turkey, and they've also developed a certain skill in operating FPV drones, suggesting that they've obtained some assistance from Ukraine. The last point, by the way, I've not got from Alistair Crook. I've obtained it from the Russian media, but it does seem as if this is the case. And as I said, for the moment, Syrian military resistance has been remarkably weak. It has been, in fact, all but non-existent. And this morning, shortly before I started making this program, the Syrian military authorities acknowledged that these Islamist fighters have indeed entered Aleppo itself. Aleppo airport has been closed. It still seems to be under Syrian government control. And there are reports that Syrian military units stationed in Aleppo have been withdrawn from various places in the city. And there are also reports, the Syrian authorities are saying that despite the fact that these fighters have entered Aleppo, they have not yet been able to consolidate their positions there. Now, the Russian media, for their part, are saying that reinforcements from the Syrian military are being rushed to the area, though they're not expected to arrive in significant number for another 3 days. Now, however one looks at this, this is clearly a debacle. The unanswered question is whether this is an operation that was launched suddenly and which took the Syrian army by surprise, or whether, for any number of possible reasons, the Syrian army has essentially melted away from the powerful force which it used to be and which basically won the Syrian civil war, or at least the previous iteration of the Syrian civil war, whether it has somehow become demoralized and weakened by the effect of the pandemic, the sanctions, the Israeli bombing of various locations of Hezbollah and the other forces in Syria, whether it's been weakened to the point where it is just in the face of an attack by these Islamist fighters that it has just collapsed. And in that case, if we're talking about the second, then this is an exceptionally grave crisis, and we would be looking at a situation rather similar to what happened in Mosul in Iraq in 2015, when ISIL launched an attack on Iraqi military positions west of the city of Mosul. The Iraqi army collapsed, and that enabled ISIL to capture Mosul itself, leading to an extraordinary crisis and the creation of the so-called Islamic State and of its caliphate, which it took several years for the combined forces of the United States and Russia and Iran, and also the Kurdish militias, the various Kurdish militias, and the Syrian and Iraqi armies eventually to defeat. Now, I'm going to guess, and I at the moment can only guess, that it is the first, that the Syrians were caught by surprise. This is despite the fact that there were rumours, reports, that the Syrian military was conducting some kind of offensive in Idlib province. But I suspect that if such an offensive was taking place, it was on a relatively limited scale. Back in, I think, 2019 or 2020, through Russian mediation, some kind of ceasefire was agreed between the Syrian military and the jihadi fighters, the Islamist fighters in Idlib province. And this is broadly held until the last few months, when, as I said, there's been some reports of some kind of Syrian military offensive in Idlib, though, as I said, it doesn't appear to have been on any very significant scale. And even though I would say that the fighters themselves have been using the fact or the claim about this Syrian offensive as their own justification for the much more powerful offensive that they have just launched. By the way, I don't take that seriously. Clearly, this, what we've just seen, is a major offensive that has been conducted in order to capture Aleppo itself. It clearly was not, as I said, simply a response to some kind of much more limited Syrian army offensive. But anyway, coming back to my main point, there has been some kind of a ceasefire in operation, given the difficult conditions, economic conditions in Syria caused by the sanctions pressure. It's likely that the Syrian army has to some extent withdrawn from this area. Military operations obviously are expensive and difficult to sustain, and it would not surprise me if President Assad's government in Damascus took a decision to stand down their forces to some degree. And that was then, that opened up the possibility for this attack, which has just happened. Now, I say that this has come as a surprise. I wonder whether it has come as a total surprise, in the sense that a number of interesting things have been taking place over the last week or so, which do suggest to me that there were concerns about what was going on the part of various parties, and that this explains some moves which I did find somewhat surprising. The first is that there has been a telephone call between Russian President Putin and Turkish President Erdogan, which took place a number of days ago. In fact, I discussed this telephone call, I seem to remember, in a recent program. It appeared to be mostly about bilateral matters, though they did talk about regional conflicts as well, and it looks as if they were talking about the situation in Syria also. Now, Alistair Crook, in that program that we did with him, Glenn Deason and I, said that the major party that has played the decisive role in equipping, rearming, training the jihadi fighters in order to launch this latest offensive is Turkey, in other words, President Erdogan's government. And this would not surprise me at all, by the way. President Erdogan has strong feelings about the Syrian conflict. He has attempted to conduct some sort of offensives himself in this area. There was one particular occasion I remember, I think it happened in 2019, when jihadi fighters backed by the Turkish army also conducted some kind of offensive against the Syrian military in this very same area. After some initial successes, they were repelled by the Syrians, backed by the Russian Air Force. He had to go to Moscow. He was eventually received in the Kremlin. He was kept waiting, as I remember, for a while in a waiting room. And it was a waiting room in the Kremlin where there were pictures carefully arranged showing former battles between the Russian and Ottoman armies, in which, of course, it was the Russians ultimately who were successful. And it was clear that the Russians were rubbing a point in to Erdogan at that time, that Russia is militarily a far more powerful country than Turkey. And it would not surprise me if Erdogan felt deeply humiliated as a result of that episode, and that he would have been looking thereafter for revenge. It is completely in character if you have followed the man closely. And of course, he's aware that the Russians have their hands full, as he will no doubt think, in Ukraine, that they're fighting heavily against the Ukrainians. We will come to all of that shortly. That this is a good opportunity, therefore, to reassert, to reverse the situation, at least in northwest Syria, to make Turkey again, and himself, obviously, major players in the conflict, and that, of course, plays some role in explaining the events that we have just seen. So this conversation between Putin and Erdogan might have been connected to this affair. I would say this, if I am wrong about this, if this conversation took place just a few days ago, just before this offensive began, and Erdogan concealed from Putin over the course of that conversation the fact that some kind of major offensive was being prepared in Syria by this Turkish-backed Islamist force, and about Turkish backing, by the way, there is no doubt, then of course he would have lied to, or at least deceived Putin by omission. Putin will be absolutely furious with this. If Erdogan humiliated Putin 5 years ago, Putin will have felt, well, maybe not humiliated, but extremely angry and betrayed by this holding back of information on Erdogan's part. And that will almost certainly affect the scale of the Russian reaction. I don't, of course, know exactly what took place over the course of this call. But anyway, there we go. That's the Turkish side. Now, it is important to say that though Alistair Crooke has talked about the role that Turkey is playing, and there's been a certain amount about this in the media in the West, and there is no doubt at all that the Turks have played a role. And as Alistair Crooke pointed out, it certainly does put Erdogan's various recent statements and speeches appearing to criticize Israel in a certain context. He has been very noisy criticizing the Israelis. He's been speaking to huge crowds. He's been ending diplomatic contacts with Israel, even at the same time as oil supplies from Azerbaijan that cross Turkey continue to reach Israel, and he has done nothing significant to affect or impede what Israel has been doing. Anyway, even as Erdogan has been talking loudly about Israel, he has taken a step against ultimately the Syrian government and by extension Syria's allies, Iran and Hezbollah, which objectively assists Israel. Because, of course, the major transit route for supplies by Iran to Hezbollah passes from Iran through Iraq, Syria, and ultimately into Lebanon, and that way to Hezbollah. And what has Erdogan done? Even as he fiercely and loudly and noisily criticizes the Israeli government, he has taken a step which puts Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah in a more difficult position, a much more difficult position, as they face off against Israel. And I ought to say that if you go to statements made by the Iranians, the Syrians, and Hezbollah, if you go to the Middle Eastern media, at least that part of the Middle Eastern media which is aligned with the so-called axis of resistance, they are making it clear that it is Israel which they see, or at least which they claim, is the party that has really brought about this crisis in Aleppo. That this was something that was organized by the Israelis alongside the Americans, and they're not saying so much about the Turks. The Russian media, by the way, is the same. It's interesting that for the moment they are downplaying the significance of Turkish involvement in this affair. Now, I think this is true. I think that the Israelis almost certainly have played a role, and the Americans also. They've never given up in their desire to achieve some sort of regime change operation in Syria. Just saying. And undoubtedly this event does play into to Israel's very significant advantage. But I would suggest that another telltale sign that the offensive did not come as a total surprise over the last few days at least is the rather surprising decision by Hezbollah to agree to the ceasefire that has just been agreed between Israel and, well, in theory Lebanon, but actually Hezbollah. Now, Alistair Crook, again in that very same programme, discussed at very considerable length why Israel agreed to a ceasefire at this particular time. Briefly, the Israeli army is exhausted. The Golan Brigade, which has been leading the battle in South Lebanon, has suffered significant losses, perhaps not so much in men killed, but in men injured and wounded. The Israeli army was unable to capture any of the key villages that it sought to capture in southern Lebanon. There's been unrest, it seems, on the part of many reservists within Israel. And according to Alistair Crook, and he is somebody who is far more familiar with the events, he's able to follow the Hebrew media in Israel, which, for example, I cannot do. Anyway, according to Alistair Crook, there's also been growing tensions within the Israeli government, within the coalition, with growing criticism of the religious parties for the fact that they do not agree that young men and women affiliated with those parties should serve in the Israeli army, so that secular boys and girls, young people in Israel, are fighting a war which, to some extent at least, it is the religious parties that are insisting upon. So there have been tensions and good reasons, putting aside whatever pressure there's been from the Americans, whatever promises have been made to the Israeli government by Donald Trump and his team about a possible ultimate showdown with Iran. There have been lots of reasons why the Israelis might have agreed to a ceasefire at this time. But I did wonder why exactly Hezbollah agreed to a ceasefire. After all, they had previously said that they would not agree to a ceasefire unless and until there was a ceasefire in Gaza. And that ceasefire has not yet been agreed by the Israelis. In the meantime, fighting continues to go on in Gaza, and yet somewhat unexpectedly, at a point when one began to sense that the military balance in the fighting in southern Lebanon was starting to shift ever so slightly in Hezbollah's advantage. The Israelis were stuck and not making much progress. The Israelis were starting to suffer losses. There were problems with the reservists. Apparently, a decision had actually been made to pull recently mobilized reservists out of the fighting. It looked as if things were slightly starting to shift back in favor of Hezbollah. And I wonder whether, again, it is this crisis in Syria that caused Hezbollah to decide, and Iran, which of course backs Hezbollah, to decide that a ceasefire is needed, because one of the major allies that has fought alongside the Syrian army in the various wars has been Hezbollah. Hezbollah fighters who were previously deployed in Syria have had to be redeployed to Lebanon to resist the Israelis there. That has helped, I suspect, to some extent in weakening the overall force posture of the Syrian military in northwest Syria, allowing this advance on Aleppo to take place, and that in turn has put at risk Hezbollah's supply lines from Iran. Now, I'm going to make here my own observation, which is that there's been a lot of discussion that one of the reasons why the Syrian military and Hezbollah and the others were not prepared for this Islamist offensive was because of supposedly heavy Israeli bombing on their positions in northwest Aleppo. Now, I have been tracking this bombing with significant degree of attention, just to keep an eye on what it was that the Israelis were doing. And I have to say this, my own sense is that the level of this bombing has not been anywhere close to being heavy enough or sustained enough to make sufficient difference so as to weaken the overall position of the Syrian military in northwest Syria. There has been a certain amount of bombing, but my overall sense has been that the weight of Israel's air force has been focused principally on Gaza and on Lebanon. There's been bombing of some supply routes into Lebanon and some warehouses and such things. But overall, the damage that has been done has been relatively limited. Not enough to explain what we have just seen. By contrast, the mass deployment of Hezbollah fighters from Syria, from northwest Syria, to Beirut and to southern Lebanon, to the area south of the Litani River, that might have been sufficient to make a significant difference. So Hezbollah, perhaps aware that this offensive was being prepared, felt obliged, and this would have been Iran's advice also, felt obliged to agree to the ceasefire so that it can now begin or resume the process of redeploying its fighters back to Syria to try to bring this whole situation in northwest Syria back under control. Now, this is my sense of the situation. Obviously, there's a lot of unanswered questions, but we're going to have to see where this goes from here. Now, what is going to happen next, and how was it possible, as I said, that this force was assembled and the Syrians were caught napping? Well, as I said, the Syrians probably were aware that there was this rebuilding of jihadi forces or Islamist forces in Idlib. They may not have expected this offensive now. And if so, that does point to a very, very significant intelligence failure. The question is, whose intelligence failure? Well, the Syrians, obviously. The question is, were the Russians, was it the Russians, was it the Iranians who were conducting intelligence operations in northwest Syria? I'm going to make a guess that over the last 3 years, most of the more sophisticated Russian intelligence analysts who were probably playing a role reviewing and considering the stream of intelligence data coming from northwest Syria, that they have been reassigned to dealing with the intelligence, analysing the intelligence from Ukraine. And I think this was a deliberate decision. And I suspect that the Russians have been saying to the Syrians and to the Iranians, well, we did our thing in Syria. We played a key role in pushing the Islamist fighters back. Now it's your job to make sure that the situation in northwest Syria is kept under control. And I suspect that if there has been any errors in intelligence analysis, this is how it has come. I'm going to guess that the Syrians and the Iranians probably do not have the same intelligence resources and analytical resources as the Russians do. And in the case of the Iranians, also, they would have had to focus principally on what Israel and the United States have been up to. But what happens next? Well, I think a few points need to be made here. Firstly, if we're talking about Russia, there is a narrative that I've seen all over the media in the West, which is that the Russians are now overwhelmingly focused on the conflict in Ukraine, and that they really don't have the men and machines to spare to involve themselves in Syria again. I think this is completely wrong and completely misreads the actual situation, in the sense that Russia is, militarily speaking, a far more powerful country today than it was when it first intervened in Syria. back in 2015. At that time, the rearmament, the re-equipment of the Russian Air Force had barely started. Most of the Russian Air Force the Russian Air Force was continuing to operate almost entirely with aircraft built during the period of the Soviet Union. Some of them had been extensively refurbished, but nowhere near to the extent that we see today. I mean, today the Russian Air Force is a completely different creature from what it was at the start of Russia's intervention in Syria back in 2015. At that time, as I remember, they just had a handful of the advanced Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, which played the key role in the bombing in Syria, and eventually. And in the first 2 years of the bombing, the Russian Air Force was not operating so much Sukhoi 34s, but Sukhoi 24s, much older aircraft, designed in the 1960s and 1970s and built entirely during the era of the Soviet Union. Today, as I said, the Russian Air Force is a completely different creature. It has far more modern aircraft in vastly bigger numbers, and it is significantly bigger overall. It is also far more experienced than it was in 2015. Its technology has improved out of all recognition. And, of course, it now has a huge stockpile, and a growing stockpile, from what I understand, of weapons, including, of course, these FAB guided bombs, of which it had none back in 2015. To understand the extent of the Russian military's growth, Russian Air Force's growth, bear in mind that the Russians have, just over the last few weeks, received more supplies, more deliveries from the military-industrial complex of Sukhoi 35s, Sukhoi 34s. There was another delivery of Sukhoi 34s just, I believe, a week ago, and also more deliveries of the Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighters. It's likely that there are around 30 Sukhoi 57s operating across the entire Air Force. At the time of the Russian intervention in Syria, I seem to remember that the number of operational Sukhoi 34s, the fighter bombers, was no more than around a dozen in the entire Russian Air Force. So we have a far more sophisticated, far bigger, far more powerful Russian military than we had at that time. Now that means that the Russians can certainly deploy or redeploy an air group to Syria, which would be significantly more powerful than the one that they deployed in 2015 or in the years that followed, and that they can do that without drawing significantly on the Air Force, their Air Force assets operating in Ukraine itself. The total size of the Russian military contingent in Syria, located at the Khmeimim air base, as I remember, at its peak, in terms of personnel, numbered around 5,000 people. Bear in mind that the Russian military in Ukraine now numbers somewhere between 600 and 800,000. As I said, the Russians can redeploy forces to Syria and do so in far more powerful force than they did in 2015. And this would not, as I said, affect their operations in Ukraine, not at least to any significant degree, in terms of manpower and aircraft and bombs and that kind of thing. Intelligence assets might be another matter. Obviously, the number of people who conduct intelligence analysis are able to conduct successful intelligence analysis at any one time is relatively small, and redeploying or reassigning some of these people back to follow the events in Syria might have an effect. But again, I think the Russians probably have enough leeway to be able to, enough in reserve to be able to deal successfully with things like that. And, well, what about the other allies? Well, I suspect that over the next couple of weeks, the Syrian military will redeploy forces or try to redeploy forces to northwest Syria. As I said, we've got reports that a significant force is being redeployed to the area, but that it will not arrive in force for a further 3 days. And of course, Hezbollah will no doubt be sending some of its fighters, and it's likely that the militias in Iraq, who are also far larger and better organized than they were in 2015, they will be sending their fighters too. And there's probably some Kurdish militias aligned with the Syrian government and with Iran who will also be prepared to participate in this operation as well. If this is what I said previously, a instance of a Syrian army that has stood down to some extent, been taken by surprise, as I said, even if they had information a couple of days ago, which I suspect they did, that something was being prepared, it's unlikely that there would have been enough time to mobilize and redeploy men in order to counter this attack. Anyway, if it was that, if it was simply a case of the Syrians being taken by surprise and not being ready for this operation when it was launched, despite all the troubling questions that gives rise to about intelligence failures and that kind of thing, then I think this situation will be brought fairly quickly back under control. It's likely that it will be stabilized, and there's a possibility that the fighters, the Islamist fighters, will be pushed out of Aleppo itself fairly quickly. If, on the other hand, we are looking at a collapse like the one that happened to the Iraqi military in the fighting in Mosul back in 2014, then, as I said, this is going to be a massive crisis. And at that point, one does wonder about whether or not the Syrian military, even with the help of the Iranians and the Russians, are going to be able to bring it back under control. That is, at the moment, the big unanswered question. As I said, on balance, I lean to the view that this was the result of some major intelligence failure rather than a collapse, but we'll just have to see. Now, turning to the last point I want to make about the events of the last 3 days, there have been some claims circulating that the presidents of Syria and Russia, Putin and Assad, have spoken with each other. That may be true, but there is nothing to that effect, nothing which confirms that so far on the Kremlin website. Having said this, one person who is going to be very angry about what has happened, is going to be President Putin himself, President Putin of Russia. As I said, if Erdogan deceived him over the course of that telephone conversation of a few days ago by plotting an offensive and concealing that fact from Putin, then Putin is going to be furious with Erdogan. As he always does, he will conceal his anger, but there will be, at some point, a price to pay. And as I said, it will affect Russia's reaction in Syria as well. But I am fairly sure that Putin is also very angry, not just with Erdogan and the Israelis, but that he's almost certainly angry with Assad and with the Iranians as well. Because I suspect he probably did think that the situation in Syria could be left to the Syrians and to the Iranians, that the Islamist fighters had been defeated largely through the work of the Russians. And I think that Putin will feel that the Iranians and the Syrians have failed. And I think that this is going to make him very angry indeed. I suspect that he's also going to feel some anger about Bashar al-Assad, towards Bashar al-Assad, because one of the stories of the last few years is of a constant attempts by President Erdogan of Turkey to try to re-establish some kind of dialogue directly with Assad, with all sorts of suggestions and proposals coming from Erdogan for the two men to meet. And it was fairly clear that the Russians were keen on that idea, as seeing it as a way towards finally bringing the conflict in Syria to an end. However, Assad, for various reasons, some good, some perhaps not so good, consistently refused to meet with Erdogan. And I think that the Russians will be saying to Assad that this whole situation has largely been created by you, in the sense that if you had agreed to meet with Erdogan and had re-established some kind of dialogue and rapprochement with him, then Erdogan perhaps would not have been motivated to rearm and retrain and reorganize the jihadis and to launch him into this attack against you in the way that he has just done. What Assad would feel about that, whether those words between the Russians and Assad will ever be exchanged, I doubt that Putin himself will say that to Assad. It's not his style. But I've no doubt that there are many people in Moscow who think this, that Assad became overconfident as a result of his success, thumbed his nose at Erdogan, made it fairly clear that he wanted to see Erdogan quit the scene politically, and that as a result of that miscalculation, born of a sense of grievance and arrogance, the Syrian war, which to all appearances had been ended, has now restarted. Anyway, there we go. The next couple of days are going to be critical. Obviously, there's the fighters, these Islamist fighters, have apparently 3 days before the reinforcements supposedly arrive to run amok in Aleppo and to do whatever damage they intend to do there, and to try to establish fortified positions in Aleppo. If once these reinforcements arrive, if they are indeed heading in that direction, if the expected Syrian counterattack fails, or if it only achieves limited success, then we're looking at a resumption of the civil war, the Syrian civil war in northwest Syria. And that is a tragedy and a disaster for the people of Syria. And it will be a major concern and distraction for the Russians. And it will add to the general sense of tension and instability in the Middle East. So there is this very high stakes game that is now being played in northwest Syria. And we will see how it goes. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the Syrian situation for the moment. I'm now going to return to a discussion of the situation in Ukraine. Now, yesterday I spoke about the very strong action that the Russians had taken over the last couple of days in response to the Ukrainian, American, British missile strikes on Russian territory in Bryansk and Kursk region. The fact that 5 ATACMS launchers, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, have been destroyed. That the Russians have been hunting Western personnel in Ukraine. It's surprising to me how little comment about this there has been, even though the Russian Defense Ministry report on this issue could not be more clear. Anyway, the Russians have been going out of their way since then, again, to make clear that their position on the settlement of the Ukraine war has not changed. The Russian Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations, Dmitry Polyansky, who, by the way, has appeared on our programs on the Duran. Anyway, he gave a very powerful address to the UN Security Council in which he made clear that the Russians are not going to retreat from their fundamental positions and that they absolutely do reserve the right to themselves to launch missile strikes against American, British, French installations across Europe and elsewhere. And of course, if Germany starts supplying the Taurus missiles after the elections in February, against Germany presumably as well. So there's a powerful address, and that there was no sign there of any weakening or softening of the overall position. Now, today, Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, has pointedly said that there is a real possibility, eventually, of a nuclear exchange, though the Russians will do everything possible to prevent it. We have said everything that needed to be said in terms of scenarios for the use of nuclear weapons. The President has made statements on the matter, and it is also reflected in the updated foundations of Russia's state policy in the field of nuclear deterrence. Saying that this risk is not there anymore would violate the truth. Unfortunately, such a risk does exist. We will do the most we can to prevent this catastrophic scenario. However, not everything depends on us. In the past, major research was carried out many times, including by professionals, in order to assess the potential consequences. Today, the situation is very difficult and tense. The United States need to understand that our messages about various possible scenarios aren't propaganda but reality. The key question is what our opponents will do and whether they will continue towards implementing the scenarios that are described in Russian military doctrine, which is the foundation of our state policy. For now, unfortunately, this is where things are heading. We need to face the truth and take note of this, which is what we are doing. I hope that our verbal and material messages are getting through to certain American officers and bunkers and aren't being dismissed as propaganda. It's not propaganda, but a stark reality that needs to be accepted. So that was Ryabkov. And the Russians are now saying other equally concerning things. Specifically, Ryabkov himself is saying that the Russians are now considering resuming nuclear tests. This is the issue. I don't want to portend anything, but we'll simply say that this issue is quite complicated. It is under constant review in the entirety of all its elements and in all its aspects. And there is a report from from another Russian official, I believe, that the nuclear test site, the Russian nuclear test site at Novaya Zemlya, which is an island in the Arctic, those test facilities are ready to be placed back in operation. The last time a nuclear test was conducted in Novaya Zemlya was by the Soviet Union in 1990, but that there is a possibility that that nuclear tests could resume because of the steady deterioration in tensions. So, further warnings from the Russians, very strong warnings from the Russians. Now, today is the 30th of November. There's been much speculation over the last couple of days that it was on the 30th of November that the next the next strike with the Oreshkin missile would take place. I've pointed out that this is all based on reports about the closure of airspace around the space center at Kapustin Yar, near the Caspian. That is far from a rare occurrence, and I'm far from convinced, actually, that the Russians would be giving away information that far in advance about when the next strike is likely to take place. So I'm not convinced that the next big missile strike, is indeed going to happen today. But anyway, we still have some hours. Perhaps it will be today. We shall just have to wait and see. That a strike will take place at some time. Of that I am fairly sure. Though I think that the destruction of the ATACMS launchers and the deaths of the US and French personnel, if that has really happened, already the Russians might think sends a significant and very strong message. Now, President Biden made some extremely strong comments directly after the major Russian strikes on the Ukrainian energy system. He said this overnight. This is on the White House website. Overnight, Russia carried out a horrific aerial attack against Ukraine. Ukrainian authorities report that Russia launched nearly 200 missiles and drones against Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure, depriving Ukrainian citizens of access to electricity. This attack is outrageous and serves as yet another reminder of the urgency and importance of supporting the Ukrainian people in their defense against Russian aggression. On this day, my message to the Ukrainian people is clear. The United States stands with you. Earlier this year, and at my direction, the United States began prioritizing air defense exports, so they go to Ukraine first. The Department of Defense has delivered hundreds of additional air defense missiles to Ukraine as a consequence of this decision, and further deliveries are underway. Well, I can't imagine that the Ukrainians take much solace from that. We've seen that despite all of these hundreds of deliveries, the Russians are still able to attack positions right across Ukraine in the way that they have just done. And then he goes on to say, for months my administration has begun working to help Ukraine increase the resilience of its energy grid in preparation for the winter, and the Department of Defense continues to surge other critical capabilities to Ukraine, including artillery, rockets, and armored vehicles. Russia continues to underestimate the bravery, resilience, and determination of the Ukrainian people. The United States stands with more than 50 countries in support of Ukraine in its fight for freedom, which of course begs the question of what the other 140 or so countries that are presumably not standing by Ukraine are doing. Now, this is an extremely unusual statement from Biden at this time, and I wonder whether what has really provoked the US, Biden himself, and the White House to make a statement like this at this time is not so much the attacks on the energy system, which is of course what Biden here is complaining about, but rather the attacks on the ATACMS launchers, the mass destruction of the ATACMS launchers, and presumably, if it's true, which perhaps it is in light of this statement, the attack and the deaths of the US personnel, and of course also the French personnel. I mean, the language horrific attack and outrageous attack which appears in this statement. After all, the attacks on the energy system have been they've been going on ever since October 2022. There's been nothing significant or particularly new there. Anyway, I wonder whether, as I said, words like horrific and outrageous aren't really more intended to express Biden's and American feelings about these attacks on the ATACMS missiles and on the US and French military personnel. And of course, in that case, this whole strange statement becomes somewhat more comprehensible. It's telling the Russians back, look, you may be destroying our ATACMS launchers, you may be killing our people, but don't think that's going to change anything. We're going to go on supporting Ukraine. We're going to send even more weapons and even more machines and even more equipment to Ukraine. And, well, you're not going to intimidate us. So that's essentially what Biden is saying. Note, however, that in this statement, he says absolutely nothing about further missile strikes on Russia, which is interesting. Could it be, just asking the question, that further strikes with ATACMS missiles on Kursk region and on Bryansk region and those sort of places have been put on hold in light of the mass destruction of HIMARS launchers in the area? Just saying. So that might explain this statement. It does give some sort of feeling about, at least to me, I'm going to say what I think. I think that this is probably what has provoked it more than anything else. But that does not mean that the Russian attack, the mass attack on the energy system that Biden is so fiercely complaining about, has not had an effect. Because it seems that amongst the principal targets that the Russians went after were the transformers. A whole cluster of them have apparently been destroyed. And the point about the transformers is that they are essential in order to transfer energy from the Ukrainian nuclear power stations across what's left of the Ukrainian electricity grid, and also, by the way, to transfer electric power to the nuclear power stations, which is obviously necessary in order to keep those nuclear power stations running. And in fact, there are some reports, even as I make this program, that the Ukrainians are now having to close, or at least close operations in some parts of their nuclear power industry, that some of the reactors are having to be taken offline. Though I'm not absolutely sure that this is the case, and all sorts of reports and rumours and stories constantly circulate that one can't assume necessarily mean very much. Anyway, there we are. That is the story about the strikes for the moment. There's been no further reports of strikes since the big Russian counter-strike. Instead, as I said, we've had this spluttering statement from Biden instead. But of course, the Russians, in the meantime, continue to hammer the Ukrainian energy system, which it is important to say is going to have a critical effect on Ukraine's whole energy situation through the winter. And of course, it's going to create a terrible crisis for the Ukrainian people during the winter. And we will see what comes from that. In the meantime, the purported purpose of the original strikes, the strikes into Russia, which was to help the Ukrainians defend themselves in Kursk region. Well, the latest reports suggest that Russian attacks, incremental attacks on the Ukrainian troops in Kursk region have resumed, and that the Russians have re-established control of the village of Martinovka, just northeast of Sudzha, or are close to doing so, which, if true, would bring the Russians very close to Sudzha again. Anyway, doesn't seem, as I said, as if these missile strikes for the moment have achieved very much. Well, there's been a lot going on the battlefronts, and I am going to turn to that shortly. But I noticed that there has been a lot of the attention instead in the media in the West, the mainstream media, parts of independent media as well, has been focusing on certain comments made by Ukraine's President Zelensky. And it's all about negotiations, the future of negotiations. And he has said that Ukraine might be prepared to accept on a temporary basis Russian occupation of some of the territory in eastern Ukraine, which the Russians occupy, and that Ukraine would agree to a ceasefire on that basis. But it will only do so in return for a guarantee, in fact, of NATO membership. Indeed, in fact, for NATO membership itself. Something, of course, which is completely unacceptable to the Russians. Many people, many commentators, and in the Western media, I think that there is a concerted attempt to try to spin this. Many are seeing this as a major shift from Zelensky's, on the part of Zelensky, from his previous insistence that every millimeter of Ukrainian territory needs to be returned to Ukrainian control, including Crimea, all of Donbass, and the rest. I have to say, I don't see it that way at all. Zelensky has at various times said many things over the course of the conflict about the kind of conditions that he was prepared to, the kind of things that he was prepared to do in order to achieve peace. It is fair to say that for most of the period of the conflict, he has categorically ruled out a ceasefire or a freeze of the fighting in any one particular place. He's always insisted that the only way the fighting can cease is if the Russians are completely driven out of every part of Ukraine, including what he says is Ukraine, including Crimea, and Ukraine can then join NATO, and then maybe there can be serious negotiations with the Russians, at which point the negotiations would be about the scale of the reparations the Russians would pay to Ukraine and the war crimes trials that Russian leaders would be subjected to, and that kind of thing. Demand, in other words, for Russia's unconditional surrender. Well, that's been his major talking point. But more recently, over the last couple of months, as it's become increasingly clear that the war has been lost, he has floated this very same, I don't think it's even a proposal, this very same conception before, which is that, yes, okay, if you have to have a ceasefire, we will agree to a ceasefire, though based on what his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, is saying, it would involve the Russians retreating back to the February 2022 lines. And that ceasefire would only be a transitional process whereby the Russians were compelled or pushed, diplomatically forced to cede ultimate control of all of the territory of Ukraine, including the territory of the two People's Republics as it was before February 2022, plus Crimea to Ukraine. And of course, in the meantime, Ukraine would enter NATO. So he has said this before. This is not actually new. And of course, it's absolutely, the key thing to say is that it is absolutely unacceptable to the Russians. Now, Zelensky is saying these things, and the media in the West, as I said, there's clearly a concerted campaign underway about this, are repeating all of this, are presenting this as a major shift in position by Zelensky. Because, of course, they know that Ukraine is losing the war, which it is, and they also know that Donald Trump appears to want some kind of a peace settlement in Ukraine, or at least some kind of ending of the American involvement in the Ukraine conflict. And what Zelensky is trying to do, also it seems to me, is to put himself in a good light with Trump and Kellogg and with the Americans. In fact, he's almost said as much. He said that there are many different voices, many different people giving advice to Trump at the present time, and that what he needs to do, what he, Zelensky, therefore needs to do, is to speak directly to Trump himself in order to get Trump to understand the position from his and from Ukraine's point of view. And I think that this is all this is. It's an attempt to try to win Trump and the administration back into what is intended to be an open-ended military support for Ukraine. In other words, to draw the Trump administration and the Americans back into the conflict in Ukraine by telling Trump and Kellogg, look, we are actually willing to make concessions. We're willing to make this concession, which of course the Russians will undoubtedly reject. It's a transitional concession, but we're prepared to show some flexibility. It's the Russians, however, who remain the aggressors, who make all of these demands upon us. And until they come round to our way of thinking, then you need to go on continuing to support Ukraine, continuing to shovel money at Ukraine, continuing to send endless supplies of weapons to Ukraine. Well, I don't know what General Kellogg is going to make of all of that. I don't know what Donald Trump is going to make of all of that. But we've now had a very interesting opinion poll from CBS News, YouGov, and it gives a sense of what the American people think. The poll, which is conducted between November 19th and November 22nd, found that 51% of Americans believe that the United States should not send further weapons or military aid to Ukraine. That is a majority. 49% do back further military aid to Ukraine, so that's still a significant number of people, but 79%, a very large majority, believe that finding ways to limit aid to Ukraine should be a priority for President-elect Trump. And 33% said it should be a high priority, whilst another 36% said that it should be a medium priority. The American people, one way or the other, want America's involvement in the war to end. That is the biggest takeaway from this opinion poll. A majority, a bare majority, would like to end it immediately, now, without any further discussion. A very significant majority, around 80%, want it to be brought to an end as soon as possible, and 33% think that this should be a high priority for Trump, and 36% think it should be a medium priority. Perhaps not the highest priority, but still a priority. If he is wise, this is what Donald Trump should listen to. The American people have had as much of Ukraine as they can take. They want their government to focus more on domestic things. The recent elections in Romania, the European Parliament elections of a couple of months ago, the elections in France, the parliamentary elections in France, elections in Austria, they all tell the same story. It's that is also the general mood amongst Western publics. They are collectively exhausted by Project Ukraine. They may not think very much about the Russians or about President Putin. They may not understand the detail of the arguments about the Minsk agreement and who broke what agreements and who was responsible for starting the war. But they want the war to end. This is a time of economic difficulty for many people. There's been very high inflation. I think many people at some level understand or sense that the inflation is connected to the war, and they want the war to be brought to an end. In Europe, governments so far do not reflect that feeling. In the United States, they voted just a few weeks ago for a new government, which they expected would. If this government, after it is inaugurated, disappoints them, there will be a significant political price to pay. Just saying. So anyway, that brings me back to what is going on in the war, because it is essential always to understand that the war is the events in the war itself are what is driving the overall political, diplomatic discussions. And here we've had about 2 or 3 days ago reports that General Syrski, the Ukrainian military commander, is again talking about an offensive somewhere. There's speculation that it will be another attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, perhaps a Ukrainian strike across the Kurachovo reservoir. Once the ground hardens later in the winter, it would be an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do, but who knows? Maybe the Ukrainians are thinking of that. Or maybe this is just brave talk from Zelensky himself, from Syrski himself, because everywhere else the situation continues to go from bad to worse. Now, as I said, I was away, for about a week in Hungary. I'm gradually piecing together what's been happening on the various battlefronts. It's, in some respects, the usual grinding story. The Russians continuing to make incremental advances, pushing the Ukrainians back, inflicting severe losses on the Ukrainians, focusing on destroying Ukrainian military units and machines. That appears to continue to be perhaps the overriding priority. But all of that is happening together with ever accelerating advances. And from what I can see, the Russians have been taking a whole series of different villages under their control in the area around Velikaya Novosilka. They have a significant presence within Velikaya Novosilka itself. They've seen now to control roughly 60% of Kurachovo and have captured a significant stretch of villages south, both south and north of Kurachovo, north of the Kurachovo reservoir. I have to say that it looks to me as if at least 2 significant cauldrons, perhaps 3 significant cauldrons, are forming. One of the Ukrainian troops within Kurachovo itself, now basically pushed back to the town's western outskirts. Secondly, in an area south of Kurachovo, where the Ukrainians are increasingly being pushed out of the villages and are at risk of being surrounded in winter in the open fields which would be a disaster for them. And lastly, in Velika Novosilka itself. Certainly, lots of villages which were still being contested before I went to Hungary now seem to be fully under Russian control. There are still some villages which I'm not entirely certain about. But it does look as if, as I said, there's been a major advances by the Russians in all of these areas, and that the Ukrainian resistance is becoming increasingly fragmented, and that the troops who are still fighting here, the Ukrainian troops who are still fighting here, are at risk now of encirclement. And the Russians, of course, also have been continuing to capture new villages, more villages southwest of Pokrovsk. I noticed that, for example, the Russians now seem to be either attacking or already in control of villages to the southwest of the important village of Lysivka, south of Pokrovsk, which I remember at one point appeared to be well to the west of Russian positions at the time, sometime before I went to Hungary. So one gets a sense of a gradual breaking down of the Ukrainian positions, and of large numbers of Ukrainian forces becoming surrounded, and of the situation becoming increasingly difficult for them. And apparently the Ukrainians short of men almost everywhere. An increasingly difficult situation, in other words, for the Ukrainians in the critical Pokrovsk center, and one which is certain to deteriorate further. And I've not heard more information over the last couple of hours about the fighting in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, though it does seem that the Russians are now well established in the central areas of Chasiv Yar and in the industrial zone, and are busy fighting to capture the various factories that are situated there. Further north, in Kupiansk, Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, has been reporting extensively about the establishment of a large Russian bridgehead west of the Oskol River, and it is now claiming, and it's only a claim, that the Russian attack on northeastern Kupiansk, the one which saw the Russians advance deep into northeastern Kupiansk, was actually a feint intended to draw Ukrainian troops away from other positions around Kupiansk, opening the way for the Russians to establish this bridgehead across the Oskol River. Now, that might be a rationalization of what has happened, or it could perhaps actually reflect genuine Russian strategy. But anyway, the overall story continues to be the same. The Ukrainians, short of men, right across the battlefronts. The Russians focusing, so far as I can see, increasingly on isolating and destroying Ukrainian units out in the open, pushing them out of the towns and destroying them in winter out in the open. And the Russians perhaps preparing for a big offensive towards the Dnieper River. Now, I don't know what plan General Syrskyi actually has for a Ukrainian offensive, whether it is directed towards Zaporozhye nuclear power plant or towards, or for another attack on Russia itself somewhere. All of that seems to me extremely unwise. I doubt that Ukraine has the forces any longer to conduct such an offensive. I suspect it's brave talk intended to boost Ukrainian morale and to somehow persuade the Americans that despite all appearances, Ukraine is still in the fight. But though the last remains the case, yes, Ukraine is in the fight, but it is a fight that Ukraine is clearly losing. Even the former Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, admitted to the Financial Times in an interview that there is now a real possibility that Ukraine could lose the war. So, there we are. The events in Syria are not going to divert the Russians from their overriding focus on Ukraine or lead to the Russians redeploying significant forces, such as would make a difference, from Ukraine to counter this attack on Aleppo. The Russians are not going to accept the terms, the proposal that Zelensky has just floated, that they're left in control of a few pieces of Ukrainian territory, but Ukraine in return is going to enter NATO and presumably will get the 100,000 Western troops that some people are talking about. None of that is going to happen. What I think we will probably see is that General Kellogg will at some point turn up in Moscow. He will presumably first want to meet with the Europeans and the Ukrainians. That has to be done, but he will turn up in Moscow. If he's wise, he will listen to what the Russians are telling him, and he will understand that the Russians are playing with extremely strong cards. If he thinks that the Russians have suffered debilitating losses and that kind of thing, and that they're looking for a way out of the war, then he has swallowed propaganda and is indulging himself in illusions. General Cavalli, the head of the NATO forces in Europe, has actually said, on the contrary, the Russian military today is bigger, more powerful than it was when the conflict began. And that is the reality. And that is the reality that is going to decide the war. Well, this is where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going by checking our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.